Welcome to What CEOs Talk About. Do you wonder what CEOs talk about behind closed doors? How they bring their vision to reality? How do they overcome and succeed through adversity? We share that and so much more with each episode. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Hunter. I am the host of What CEOs Talk About, where we translate vision into frontline operations. Today, the dynamic duo. We have two awesome authors of the book, I Need to Fucking Talk to You. And a great set of behavioral-based card shift, and we can talk about it later on. But these two great tools. Ken and Russell, thank you very much for being on the show.
Oh, it's a great pleasure for us to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Ken, how about we start with you? Can you give us a kind of 2 to 3 minutes? Who are you currently? Give us your full name, position. What do you do for a living currently?
Absolutely. My name is Ken Cameron. I'm the CEO and shift disturber at Corporate Culture Shift. So it's an organization that helps leverage great performance through an organization's culture.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Russell, your turn.
And I'm president and the leadership champ at Blue Gem Learning, and I focus on helping leaders improve individual and team performance in their teams.
Before we go with the title of the show, it's important for the listeners and the audience to understand who the speakers are. So, Russell, can you start us off? Where are you from? How did you grow up? Because it tells a lot how a person has grown up and their journey to where they are today is really good. Can you tell the audience, where are you from? What's your journey to kind of where we are today?
Okay, so Russell Stratton. I was born in West London, and I spent most of my formative years in either West London or North London in the UK. As people may have recognised by my accent, I'm not from the same place of the world as you two guys. I moved to Canada 10 years ago, so I'd been in the UK up to that point. Schooling, fairly average. I lived in a working class, lower middle class area. Went to a school that was okay in a pretty rough area. It was probably a better school in a rough area. Couldn't wait to leave. Went straight to work from there. So I came out with my high school diploma equivalent and went straight into work. And I did my qualifications, so my degree and master's degree, as an adult. So quite late in life. I was in my 30s and then in my 40s when I did my master's degree. I didn't do this straight out of school. I went straight into work life from working at the bottom. It's sort of bar work. Cleaning, administrative assistant, bit of construction work, bit of manufacturing. So I did a lot of those entry-level jobs and a lot of stuff where you were at the sort of bottom rung on the ladder in the corporate hierarchy, so to speak. I worked for the UK Customs Service for a number of years, various roles in there, all that had a training and leadership bent to it. So I worked in some of the operational teams. I worked with HR there and internal consultancy and training. Had a period of secondment to the Metropolitan Police in London, or as Ken likes to refer it, as Scotland Yard. I actually worked around the corner from Scotland Yard. You didn't have a handsome cab and a deer stalker cap and pipe or anything like that. Well, I worked with a good colleague of mine, a gentleman by the name of Fergus Lawson, on their leadership development team, which was looking about improving leadership capability in the Metropolitan Police. For those people who are listening who aren't aware, the Metropolitan Police is the largest police service in London. London's a population of about 9.5 million, so there are a fair number of police officers, and our role was trying to improve the leadership capability there. I came back to Customs, ready for the merger with the Inland Revenue, which was an interesting and probably subject that you could talk about in a podcast on its own, about mergers of two organisations. Very much in the learning and development sphere there. The only thing I will say, or when the idea of merging two cultures, imagine that Customs had a culture that was like a cross between the Royal Navy and the police. and the Inland Revenue has a culture like a firm of accountants. So the idea they're both revenue collecting, let's join them together and then wonder how that gets on. There's a story in itself.
Oh, we know all about M&A. That's what we do for a living. We roll up companies, so trying to merge companies. So no matter how much you think people are aligned, there's just ways of people doing things that just kind of, right? Just let's look at Western culture as a whole. You know, you look at most of the Commonwealth drink tea in North America. You know. In the U.S. coffee, Ted Lasso is a great example of that. If anybody's watched Ted Lasso, how he despises tea and how the rest of the world enjoys it. So I appreciate that.
For sure. And then I sort of started working my own sort of consultancy firm focusing on leadership development, simply because I got fed up for working for people that knew less than I did and getting paid a lot less than they did. And that was one of the reasons why I said, hey, I can do this better. So I did. I've run that business in the UK, and then latterly I moved to Canada. So probably I'm nearly 20 years of running that private consultancy firm. And the type of clients I'd had on both sides of the pond were a mixture of sort of non-profit organisations, particularly those that were working around with families and domestic violence and victims of domestic violence, which was an area that sort of ended up within both countries. Law enforcement and emergency services, number of ex-military personnel, and then moving into areas such as construction and manufacturing. Public sector I tended to steer away from because I'd worked in it for a long time and didn't want to necessarily go back. And that was the idea of coming back and then moving to Canada as something that was an opportunity to do something that was different. And as part of that was driven, as I say, my late father was a guy who through circumstances, in some ways, didn't follow a career path that he perhaps would have really enjoyed. He was in the military for some time and probably always should have stayed in the military. He didn't, and always left and regretted it. And I didn't want to be somebody that said, when I was, if I got to 80 years old, saying, I wish I had done this and never done it. So I remember hearing him say that a lot, and I didn't want to be saying that myself. So when I had things that I wanted to try and do, like start my own business or emigrate to Canada, work with Ken, these were things that I just said, look, I'm going to do it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, then I'll do something else. I didn't want to have any regrets. So basically that's brought me to where I am, if that gives you enough of a feel for that.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. And I'm assuming that Ken is not the reason why you moved to Canada. You guys met after the fact. Is that so, Ken?
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely right. So we actually met at a morning breakfast networking meeting. We both started our own consultancy firms. Russell just moved here, and Russell had been doing some various different things. And we were at this morning breakfast club meeting, and one of our mutual friends said, "Oh, Russell, you have to meet Ken. He does strange things with actors, and you do strange things with horses. So the two of you should get along famously." So I took a step back, but I trepidatiously shook the gentleman's hand, and from there a strong bond of friendship, both personal and business, was born.
Fabulous. So tell us your story, Ken.
Well, it probably couldn't be more different than Russell's. I grew up in Canada, the child of 6 generations that had lived in this country, descended from Scottish on the one side and English, Irish Quakers on the other side. So I grew up and grew up on a farm. So I grew up with strong rural connections, strong family connections, deeply embedded in sense of place, deeply aware of history. And I had no place on the farm, even from a young age. I was a dreamy child. I was an imaginative child. I was a very playful child, and a quiet reader as well. So I moved away from the farm to go to a boarding school as a young child, and as a teen, I meant to say, and then from there moved further and further away into first Toronto, then Montreal, and then over here to Calgary as I pursued my education, and I landed on a career in the theatre. So I became one of Canada's foremost and most produced playwrights. So I've written
wow.
hits that have been done all across Canada, and that have been great kind of plays that have really made an impact on a lot of different people's lives, and that have told really great and wonderful stories, and that's been marvelous. And I also had a parallel career as an arts administrator. So you don't make a lot of money as a playwright. Like you spend a lot of time, like anywhere between 4 to 8 years, working on a single play, and with no real guarantee that it's going to be a success. Right? So and I was lucky enough that I had, out of the 25 plays I've written, I've had 2 major successes, and that's more than most people get.
Oh, wow.
But I also, I paid the bills by being an arts administrator, and that parallel path led me to running Canada's National Theatre Festival in partnership with the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. So I was commuting between Calgary and Ottawa, managing a board of high-profile theatre people who in themselves ran theatres all across the country, and I was commissioning plays that went on to Broadway success and so on and so forth. And it was it really was the pinnacle of a career that somebody in the arts would want, somebody in the theater would want. And after doing that for 4 to 5 years, after a great deal of burnout, I walked away. And I walked away from that festival. I walked away from arts administration. I did maybe about 4 more plays, and then even that was leaving me burned out. And I really felt I needed to do something else. And I followed in the footsteps of 2 close friends of mine who had moved into business consultancy, and I followed into their footsteps and eventually found my own path and in the own work that I want to do in this in the world of business. And that, or for the past, I would say it's been about 10 years, Russell, since I started that journey, has been marvelous.
It amazes me how you guys have such different paths. Yet here we are today with a title of the show that is called
Bosses Suck. It's time to be a leader.
Da 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 da. So why did we, Russell, what in there is so moving for you? Why did we choose, because we kind of, for the audience, we whiteboarded this idea to make sure that we had a meet in the middle that was really what drives Ken and Russell, right? So you guys are a dynamic duo because you guys have your own podcast as well, right? What's the podcast called?
It's called I Need to Effing Talk to You, the podcast.
Exactly, which is the same title as the book. So let's look at that one. You guys can go see and listen to Ken and Russell talk. What brings you together? Why did we choose that title, Russell? What's the magic sauce between you and Ken?
Okay, well, if we're thinking about why the title, two things really. The first is about why the title's important. So, throughout my career, I've worked for and with a lot of people in let's say in a managerial role. They have the title of manager or some variation thereof, and I've worked with, in terms of supporting through a consultancy and coaching role, an even more greater group of people and managers. Some of them are truly leaders, and some of them were just bosses. And why I mean that, they have the title, but they don't really deliver any value behind that other than they have the organisational title. And before we were on air, I shared with you a couple of questions that I ask groups that I'm working with. And one is, who's the best manager you've ever had? And who was the worst manager you've ever had, or worst leader you've ever had? And what were the characteristics of both? And people would complete that. And often people could give you lots of examples of the negative, less examples of the positive. And one of the things I said, the reason that I do the work that I do, is I would like people to be able to be remembered by their own teams as great leaders in their organisation, not as terrible bosses. Not as the people you go, oh, I remember that guy, I remember that woman, it was awful to work for them. So that's what I was aiming to do, to get people to move from that, bosses to leader, and be somebody that people will remember for the right reasons. Where that linked in with Ken is for me, it was very important in helping people on that journey, that it wasn't just enough to give people knowledge. You had to help people to experience an experiential activity that would allow them to change how they behave so that they can then behave differently back in the workplace. So my conversation with Ken at that breakfast meeting, or following from that breakfast meeting, was about the activation of learning. And what I was interested with Ken's background was what he'd done in the theatre world and with the arts, of using that to activate people's learning. So the workshop that we have that centres around having difficult workplace conversations, which is what the book's all about, is the use of arts-based learning activation with participants so that they can, what we say, act their way into a new way of being, and then when they go back to work, they're able to do it, rather than, here's a great model that you can use, now see you later and have best chance applying it.
No practice, absolutely, right? We do a similar exercise. You know, you think about the best person that's influenced you, and you said it in there, he made me feel awful. He or she made me feel awful, right? And when you turn that around and you go, well, who made you feel comfortable? Who made you feel like you were growing? And then they'll go, oh, you know, Coach Jimmy, when I was 9 years old, made me feel like a superhero because of this, right? And you're okay, well, what was he doing? That behavior, that think, feel, do is what a lot of people tend to forget. And that's what we do when we roll up companies and we merge the companies, and they're very transactional. And I say, well, have you been a transformational leader? Have you been able to help your people grow? And what I think what you guys are doing is you're acting it out. You're really practicing. It's hard to, I mean, rugby is a huge part of our family's life. My boy, my daughter, I've played rugby. You can't be good if you don't practice. And you can't expect leaders to, because they're adults, to say, here's your book, here's an SOP, go do it. Like OJT, on-job training, is the best way to learn anything. Wonderful, wonderful. Ken, what about you? Why is this title important to you?
Well, it's important to me because it's about, for me, a lot of the work that drives me is making workplaces better for everybody who works in them. And we know that so much of an organizational culture it's driven in two parts. It's driven by the people who live in the culture, but it's also driven by the leader who leads that culture. And it's an equal measure, both parts, in my view. It's 50% the people who work within the pool, so to speak, and then another 50% the lifeguard who leads the pool. And so my goal in the work that I try to do is to make workplaces not suck. And I have a saying on my website that ordinary sucks. Because so much of of workplaces that we live in are really, they're getting by okay, right? Like they're relatively ordinary. They're doing okay. They're maybe not exceptional workplaces, but they're not toxic necessarily. And I might do a little kind of caveat in here that I don't generally work with toxic workplaces. I find that's a little bit like pushing water uphill. I'd much rather work in an organization that wants to achieve more. And yet I often find, to go back to that point around ordinary, that, so many of us settle for ordinary. And you've probably heard that expression, that if you're standing still, then you're falling behind. Because none of your competitors are standing still. They're moving forward, they're innovating, they're striving, they're working to become as exceptional as possible. So if you're ordinary, then you're falling behind, and falling behind sucks. So let's not settle for an ordinary workplace. Let's not settle for an ordinary culture. Let's not settle for ordinary leadership. Let's try to create exceptional workplaces. Let's create exceptional cultures that are driven by exceptional leaders.
I want to bring it back to the arts. You go to a play or a movie and you go, how was the movie? You go, meh. Will you remember that movie? No. If you go to a movie, like my kids and I have watched Kung Fu Panda like 1,000 times, right? 1,000 times. And we all laugh because it is, like you said, it's not ordinary. It's a bit different. And I agree, no matter what size of the organization you are. And again, people tend to say, if you're not moving forward, people tend to view growth as excessive or at a velocity one step in front of the other. Like people tend to say, oh, change, it brings so much risk. Why? Just one step at a time, right? I want to bring it back to these shift cards because this is really important to me. I speak my values every single day. We get shit done. We demonstrate care. We're well-grounded. We learn and we innovate and we act on data. Those are our core values. And every single day I ask my leaders, have you demonstrated those? Have you pushed those forward? Have you moved the organization forward? And are you demonstrating those? Because I think what you're saying is exactly in this shift. Being ordinary means that you're just settling. I love that word. I love that word. It's not bad and it's not good. And you're just kind of settling. What kind of marriage is that? You know, I've been married for 19 years now. And if we just settled all the time, what are you doing? You're just showing up. You're not enjoying the journey. That's such a powerful word.
I agree. It's a motivating word too, as you've described. Like, who wants to settle? Who wants to be ordinary? Who enjoys the status quo? You know, so many of us are frightened by change, but enticed by change as well.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, I related back to being a boss and being a leader and being in a stagnant or settling. I think that's your job as a leader. What do you guys? So, what is the top thing that you see? And let's just keep it settling. Let's not change the world completely. When an organization is flat and blah, what are some of the leadership issues that you see right away? They're not bad leaders and they're not good leaders. What's the behavior that you most likely see that catches your eye and go, oh, that's a quick fix. That's easy.
So it was one of the things that I've seen with people where it's sort of just like, meh. And it comes back to our book there is people not addressing issues that come up when they're this small. So those that are listening, when it's small, rather than what they wait till the problem gets to be a big problem. And this is where I sort of combined with my as an operational manager, with my consultancy role and then my HR role, is that often what I found is that, you know, the sort of problems that came over performance, attendance, behavior, which were causing a problem within a team and then potentially within the organization as a whole, if that gets replicated across other teams, often started as something fairly small. They didn't start as a big problem. It started as a small problem. And whether it's through a lack of courage, a lack of understanding, a lack of confidence, a lack of field of tools, capability to be able to deal with it, the issue gets left, and then suddenly it grows and it grows and it grows, and that's when it's, you mentioned toxic workplaces, that continues over a period of time, and you see the same types of problems reoccurring again and again. And when you trace back to its origin, it was often, not maybe just one point, but maybe a series of small points that could have been addressed at the time. The leader at the time could have addressed that. They could have resolved it. The situation could move forward. Instead, it's left to fester, and it does nobody any good. It doesn't help them as the leader. It doesn't help them do their job better. It doesn't help the team. It doesn't help the organisation. It doesn't help the individual. One of the things you look at is people are just left to flounder. One of the things we say on our workshops with people when they say, well, yeah, but if you challenge people where people don't like that, we said, well, yeah, there is an element. Sometimes people don't like perceived criticism. But I said, what if you had a point where there was part of your job that you did that you weren't particularly good at, and everybody that you worked with knew you weren't good at it. None of them wanted to say anything to you because they didn't want to annoy you or upset you, so they all kept quiet. But day in, day out, week in, week out, they watched you struggle doing something. And they would just go around behind you with a dustpan and brush and just clear up after you. But nobody ever told you. What would that be like? Even if the conversation was uncomfortable for you at the time, wouldn't you like to know? Wouldn't you like to be able to have the opportunity to address it? maybe get some support to help you, or just leave people. And I think that's, for me, has always been one thing. Is issues come up and they're just not dealt with. And it just gets moved around until eventually it becomes a big problem. And then the organisation's running around saying, oh, we need to solve this. We need to bring these people in. And great, we need this organisational change. And, really, so yeah, a lot of this could have been dealt with at the source early on.
And the thing that strikes me about that story is, like, we think that we're being nice to the person, or we think we're doing the person a favor by not bringing them stuff, by not making them uncomfortable. But what kind of favor are you doing to the person by letting them fail at their job? And, a year, 2 years, 3 years go by, and finally, the person's like, you know what, we're going to let you go. We're going to fire you because you can't do this part of the job really well. And, well, why didn't you tell me? We've known for years that I'm bad at this job. You didn't tell me. You didn't offer me any training. So what kind of leader are you if you're not willing to put on the big pants and have the conversation that you need to have with your team to make them better?
I absolutely love this. Most of the time, it is not as intense as that. People tend, because the word settling for me is magical, because people are afraid to having performance management conversations on a regular basis. They wait for the quarterly, they wait for the annual, even in small businesses, and say, oh, I'll talk to them. No, as a leader, your job is to be curious. Hey, Ken, why did you fuck up yesterday? As simple as that. Oh, well, I wasn't paying attention. Okay, why were you not paying attention? Well, I don't know. My dog's really sick and my head wasn't in the game. Oh, I'm sad to hear. Did you tell your supervisor? No, my dog, man, I don't want to be seen as, okay, well, Ken, this is important. Your safety is important to me. So on. So I think too many leaders just settle and are not curious. Your job is to ask questions. Your job is to fix things. Your job is to be a problem solver. And too many times they just kind of let it settle. And all of a sudden they go, oh. And then as an employee, Ken, you knocked it, right on the head. I was like, well, nobody told me. Well, okay. So as a leader, we always say 4 critical activities: direction, facilitation, elevation, celebration. You should be doing that every single day. You're providing direction if somebody doesn't know what they're doing. You're facilitating work. I'm struggling. Okay, well, facilitate the work. How do you elevate the individual? And then lastly, how do you celebrate? Now, if you're the leader, there's nobody giving you that. So you have to make sure that you're doing it for yourself. How are you facilitating your work? How are you creating direction for the organization? How are you elevating and facilitating and celebrating yourself? I think that too many people leaders or bosses tend to point the finger out when they should focus on them first, on making them the best person that they can be. And then all of a sudden, kindness, compassion, empathy, because they know how difficult sometimes life can be. I was addicted to Coca-Cola most of my rugby career. I had some pretty, I'm Scottish from heritage. My father would say all the time, 2 cans of Coke and a bag of chips, but chips like not crisp, French fries, right? So, but then playing rugby 6 days a week, I'm now from the age that I was like 9 years old when I first started playing rugby. Can you imagine 2 cans of Coke 6 times a week? Just like the damage that it's done, where when I see a can of Coke, I have to do everything that I can to not drink it. Right? It's ingrained in me. But until I find a way to break that by being curious and by testing different things as a leader, you have to own that to be able to let other people do the same, right?
And it's interesting the point you mentioned there about that sort of empathy and understanding. And sometimes I feel that people misunderstand that, and that their intention is to be empathetic and understanding. I don't want to hold people to account, because that would be unkind.
True.
This is back to the point. You're not doing anybody any favors by not having that conversation. I mean, one of the questions that you would ask people that I'm leading, and would encourage leaders to ask some people, is how can you be even better? And why I like the even better phrase is that that's applicable whether you are, an absolute rock star at what you do, or whether you're somebody who's new and starting out and just learning your way. Everybody can be even better, and it might just be that incremental step. It doesn't have to be, a massive, complete change of what you do. It could just be one small thing that they do differently. And I think if you get into the habit of doing that with people and asking them, then they can find, ways to be, as a leader, to facilitate people being even better than they were yesterday. And they only have to do one small thing a day. And you imagine, one small thing a day for 365 days suddenly totals up to some sort of, big step forward that you wouldn't otherwise have had.
I learned this in big corporate world. We had giving feedback. A lot of leaders don't understand the methodology that can be utilized to provide feedback. So we call it the feedback engine, and think of two things. You never give positive or negative feedback, because if I say, Ken, I'd like to give you some positive feedback, you're going to be all excited. And I go, Russell, I'd like to give you some negative feedback. You're going to say, well, who the hell are you to give me that? So we've changed the words from, hey, Ken, can I offer you some success feedback? You were successful at achieving what I had asked you to do. Russell, can I offer some guidance? Right? It's the same thing. I'm offering some feedback to adjust the behaviors, right? Where you go, context, action, result. Yesterday, Ken, during this meeting, you paused and you let other people speak. That the result is that we truly demonstrate care within the organization, which is our second value, right? And then you use the same methodology where it's CAR-R, context, action, result, in a impact to the business. So Russell, at the meeting yesterday, you interrupted everybody. Therefore, what do you think it created? Oh, well, we didn't live our second value of demonstrating care as being a boss and not a leader. Okay, Russell, what can you do different? And I think too many leaders forget that feedback is the most powerful thing. And you've heard it from Russell and Ken saying it right now. If you provide success or guidance feedback once a day per individual, will take you about 10 minutes. The impact that you will have on your business is ginormous. It's extreme. Just take the time to do it.
Yeah, and this kind of incremental feedback, I heard it called the other day, management by walking around, which I've heard before as a negative phrase, but I've also now I'm hearing it as a good phrase. That sense of walking around, talking to people when they're in the work that they're doing. I think, Russell, you've used the phrase catching people in the act of doing something right.
Oh, yeah.
Did I get the phrase right?
Yeah, catching people doing something right. It's one of Ken Blanchard's phrases from one of his books, and said, the idea that, as Ken says, by managing by walking about, we say it's like, you can't lead people from behind your desk. You have to lead. There's certain activities you can do from behind your desk, obviously, but you have to be out there, on the shop floor, on the job site, wherever it is that you have to be where your people are, so that you can be knowing what's going on for them, to do two things: catch people doing things right, and when they're doing it right, saying to them, that was great, that was that sort of, the praising, well done, more of that. What made you do that in that way? Yeah, that was a great idea, do more of it. Because if people don't know they're doing it right, then they're just going to hope they are. And then if occasions where things haven't gone right, you're able to take that early proactive management action to get in there and have the conversation to say, okay, how can we be even better here? How can we move it forward and give people some support to be able to do that? But they still own it. But if you don't get out there amongst people, then you don't know. And you can't, as you said there, just have the quarterly appraisal where you sit somebody down and give them a variation of the shit sandwich. Here's for those that don't know, here's something good, here's something bad, here's something good, just to make you feel good before you walk out. Everybody knows it's coming, and they're just sitting there thinking, what's this all about?
Okay, so everybody knows the shit sandwich. I was like, okay, something good, something bad, and you go, okay, all right. So tell me, or whatever. I agree. I think it's we're well past that. Trying to kind of ring around the rosy around the conversation. Don't turn around the conversation. Just be frank, be kind in how you approach the conversation. If you're the leader, you've either earned it or being paid to do it, either or. And your job is to make people better. And so if having a conversation with Ken and Russell, your employees, your team members, is your job is to make them better. And providing feedback is not something that should be, when people come up to me and go, Martin, can I talk to you? I say, yeah. Can I give you some feedback? Absolutely. You're okay with that? Well, yeah. Tell me what did I do wrong? In that sales call, you were, you went kind of down a path and you didn't really let them talk. Oh shit. I'm so passionate about what I do that I forgot to ask questions. Oh, thanks, man. I really appreciate that. I'll take that as a gift. And so many people tend to forget that feedback is a gift.
And I think one of the things you used, Martin, in your example story a few moments ago, you were giving us examples of leadership by walking around, but each of the things that you were providing feedback on in your fictional example were culture points.
Correct.
The examples you were using were not about like, oh, you turned the screw incorrectly, or you didn't fill out the paperwork properly, or you did the form incorrectly. You were elevating the mundane to the culture level. It was along the line. And it might have been that there was an error on the screw or on the piece of form, but true leadership is saying, at this organization, we really pride ourselves on quality. It's one of our core values. And when I look at this report that you wrote, I see that there are many fields left blank in the form, and that's not an expression of the way that we approach our work. It's not one of our values at the company. So this notion of leadership by walking around is really leadership through culture. It's really about creating the kind of workplace in which people can achieve their best and can excel their best by leveraging the way in which we do things around here, by leveraging the culture, by leveraging the way in which we behave with one another.
It's so for the audience, I will give you an example of how critical what Ken and Russell are doing right now when it comes time to practicing your leadership skills. Okay. So I was working with BNSF Railways, and one of the top general managers, because I was the head project manager and owner of what we were doing, I got the big dogs. And this one guy, I still remember down in Texas, big drawl and mountain of a man. His father was a railroader. His grandfather was a railroader. It ran through his blood. So he comes up to me and he says, I appreciate what you're doing, but I don't know what you're going to teach me. I said, okay. As a leader, what is your job? Well, I need to give them direction. Okay, great. And again, the answer did not matter. It's whatever he gave me that I was going to evaluate. I said, okay, what's the two messages that you want to leave with him? I want to leave with him with not high railing, which is hanging on to the rails as they're building the train. So hanging on and coming off the train when it's moving. So it's very unsafe. And the second one was performance management. We have performance management coming along. So I said, okay, you go out there. Let's brief one of the crews. Crew comes in. He talks for about 15, 20 minutes, and he drops his two messages at the middle. And so I said, okay, thank you very much, Mr. X. Can you leave the room for a sec? So I handed out 2 sticky notes to the 10 people that were there. I said, can you put the 2 top things that Mr. X wanted you to really remember? And he said, so I gathered up. I said, okay, so Mr. X, how out of 20, how did you score? He says, well, not to boast, and because I don't want to give myself 100, I'll say 90%. I said, how are you with 40% success rate? He's like, what the hell? I said, yeah, people talked about barbecues. People talked about not parking in the handicap spot. People talked about this, talked about that. He was deflated. And I said, so I'm not telling you, I'm not giving you a secret sauce. I'm just offering you practice to change the pitch, change what you're doing so that you're more impactful as a leader and you're not just being a boss. And we went out there and we changed the pitch where he would finish with those 2 things. And he was a great leader, so he applied that immediately. So he knocked it out of the park 100% of the time, the 6 other times. So if you're listening, and what Ken and Russell are saying is that practice, practice, practice. So when the day comes when you have something really important to say, you know how to deliver it and how you're not a boss and a leader. Sorry, the opportunity was there for me to drop that. And I think what you guys are doing is critical, because too many people put this emphasis, I'm the boss, I'm the leader, I'm the owner, I should know better.
Yeah. And you know what the thing that you're working on there is something that I've learned as the rule of primacy and recency. So we remember the first thing we were told, and we remember the last thing we were told, and we kind of zone out on all the shit that's in the middle. And, you know, this is one of the things that's wrong with the shit sandwich, because you tell somebody something nice, and then you tell them the important stuff that you want them to remember, and then you tell them something nice at the end. And according to the rule of primacy and recency, all they remember is barbecues and play day is coming up, or like team building day is coming up, right? They don't remember don't high rail and the performance thing is coming up. They don't remember that stuff because you dropped it in the wrong place. You know, I learned this as a playwright, theater director, and whatnot. Like, I remember combing through my plays once upon a time and realizing, I put the important shit in the middle of the sentence, which is really stupid. You got to put the punchline at the end of the sentence, otherwise everybody laughs and they don't hear they don't hear the rest of the information. So you got to make sure. And I remember going through one of my plays once and like literally rewriting every sentence so that the joke was at the end or the important piece of information was at the end. And oh my God, like it actually made way more sense. It communicated its message more clearly. And so I tried to bring a lot of these principles that I've learned from the arts world into the world of business. That's just a simple one around communication. But we also do that around the role playing in this program that we call I Need to Effing Talk to You. You know, you've likened it to steroids. You've likened it to steroids. You've likened it to role playing, but we call it role playing on steroids. Because one of the issues around role playing is, like, let's say you and I, Martin, let's say you and I, we're coworkers, we work together. Maybe we're both leaders in the team. We're taking this training course. We're told by the facilitator that we're going to need to do a little bit of role playing. So we're going to, break out around our little table, you and me, nobody else is watching. And we're, we're not actors. So we're going to kind of do it the best we can. But, we both know what we're trying to get out of it. So I want you to succeed. So I'm going to kind of lead you there. I'm going to make it easy on you because, it's going to be my turn next. And I want you to make it easy on me. So neither of us are learning, basically, right? We bring in an actor. We write a scenario that's we've researched with the company, so it's as close to real life as it can possibly get. We get the actor up there, and we don't give the actor a script. We give them a scenario, so they're improvising their way through this. They're responding to what's being said in front of them, and the actor is trained not to make it easy. So a participant comes up, they run into a roadblock. We give them a chance to call timeout. They check in with the audience. They get a good idea. Yeah. They can either proceed or they can swap, tag out. Another person comes in and kind of picks up the sentence from where we left off. What they do might work. And then the actor, because they know the scenario intimately, the actor gives them another obstacle. Well, yes, I was late every day for work. And you're right, I was late every day for work and it won't happen again. But the reason I'm late every day is because of that other guy I work with, because it's his fault. So now you got something else you need to kind of deal with. Right? So you got to kind of uncover that. And then once you've solved that problem, there's something else. And so just like in real life, you're realizing that the problem is never the problem.
Mm-hmm. No, I can't tell how important it is, because then what happens is that a leader's job is to improve the leader. So if in the organization, you have an executive, you have a leader of leaders, and you have your frontline supervisors. And your job as a leader of leaders is to make other leaders better. So if you're not ready and willing to elevate your game by going at bat and doing what Ken and Russell are doing, saying, okay, all right, let's go. I'm ready. Give me everything you got. And you step up, and you fail, you don't. At least you step up and you swing, right? That's the key thing, is that you do it. You do it. You don't just read about it.
I think that's the sort of, essential part of it, because as we were saying, if people, actually put it into practice, then they have a much better chance of remembering it because they've experienced it, what worked, what didn't work, watch somebody else go, I had trouble with that, but you put it, wonderfully. Now, what was that phrase you used? Let me use that. And, I've done a lot of training. I've been on a lot of training, as no doubt you have and many of our listeners have, where we get scenario-based, which is the first part of what we're doing, is give them the scenario. Yeah. And then we say, well, what would you do in that situation? And it could be a leadership situation, it can be customer service, it can be negotiating with a client or supplier, whatever the context is. And most people can tell you what should happen. You know, I could do this. If you ask me, I would do these things. So what we take to the next level and say, okay, that sounds great. Now you're going to do it. Because what looks easy, and we've had people say to us, well, this isn't rocket science. You say, well, it's not. No, it isn't rocket science. Conceptually, but being able to do it well is more difficult, and that's a skill that we need to learn. And that part about, well, okay, if it goes wrong, it goes wrong. I say to people all the time on our workshops, the worst thing that happens to you today is your ego might get bruised for a moment. There's no zombie apocalypse. There's no fire-breathing dragons. The floor's not going to open and you disappear. You're not going to get fired. You haven't got somebody who's going to go to the trade union and put a complaint in about you. Here's your chance to practice these type of challenging conversations, have a chance to have a rerun, get ideas from others, get feedback from the actor in character about why they behaved, why did they react in that way when you said that. That's invaluable for you to play test it. And so when you go out for real and the following day you actually have to have that conversation with a real member of staff, you go out there and, as you said, you can knock it out the park because you've got the process, you understand it, you've practiced it, you've looked at all the different options of what could go, and you've play tested that in front with somebody who's given you those different options. And why wouldn't you want that opportunity to do it rather than saying, well, I'm just going to take the one page that you gave me and I'm going to go there and hope for the best?
Your training is a force multiplier when you think about it, though. Because you're not just gaining from the practice. So if I'm an owner and I say, okay, I'm going to do this with Ken and Russell and I'm going to invest in. So what's your class size usually? How many do you guys get in the class with a corporation? 10, 15, somewhere around there?
Yeah, that's the ideal class size is 10, 15. We've also done versions of this in front of over 100 people. And in which you have some people come up one at a time, and those are very successful. They're very entertaining. They're really great, and people do learn by watching others succeed. But the best results are in the small class sizes.
The oxytocin that is built in within the team, because what the team will do is remember that training. Man, we laughed so hard. It was so funny. You know, Ken went at it, and man, he sucked so bad at it. Ken wasn't good. You know, Russell was not as tough as we think Russell was. You know, and Martin, you know, blubbering idiot. You got, and so you build this relationship that is outside of the normal day to day. The normal what's the word that we called it before? Now I just forgot the word. Not stagnant. Oh, damn it. Settling. So now you've got fun, you've got activity, you've got emotion, you've got some type of energy that comes from just practicing together and being together in a form of learning and development where people are vulnerable and courageous at the same time in that. Oh, I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours.
Just give one point
Russell,
there that
absolutely
illustrates what you were saying, but just flipping it, not necessarily from, well, we looked at how people sucked when they were doing it, but the other side, how we were surprised at what people showed us, our co-workers, that we weren't familiar with. So very briefly, Ken and I did a workshop pre-COVID, oil and gas services company. It was to do with respect at work, and it was to do with, how we interact with each other in a respectful manner in the workplace. Now,
and keep in mind, these are hard hats and work boots. Yeah. So these are people who work out in the field all the time.
They've come into the room. It was a larger group. They all sat at the back.
Roughnecks, right?
And they're like, okay, what's this? Now, to bear in mind, what they'd had in the past was HR came and gave them a PowerPoint presentation, signed that you've read the policy, and that's it. So we start our typical style of workshop. We go through some of the ideas of what you could do, some of the scenarios, and then we have the action. People get to come up and practice challenging some of the unacceptable behaviour. So they're doing this, and people are starting to edge forward on their seats. People are starting to come down to the front because now they want to get involved, and they're watching. And as they're going, they're seeing what they're doing, and they're seeing what their colleagues are doing. And there's one guy, older guy, gentleman. Probably he was related to the guy you talked about on the railroad. You know, he'd been there, man and boy. His father had been there, man and boy, and he'd been pretty quiet up to this point. And then there was some point where his colleagues were struggling with one of the scenarios. And then he sort of, if you remember, Ken, he sort of stopped and he sort of went, "Oh, shit." And he just goes, "All right, I'm up." He just comes up, gets there, and they're laughing like, "Oh, it's, Jim's come up here. Well, what's he going to have to say?" No one expects, what's he going to do? Yeah. The guy literally nails it. He's like, he switched. He flips a switch. He went from being that sort of more sort of graphic, his whole demeanor changed. The questions he asked, the way he handled it, the way he talked to the actor being the individual here, and resolved it. And like in a few minutes, he'd suddenly moved that person from point A to point B. And then we were, that was great. That's exactly what we've been talking about. And the thing for people that they were all sort of sitting there with their jaws open like, "Oh my word," was because they said, "Well, we never knew." I've worked with him for years. I never knew that he was a very quiet guy. I didn't realise he did this. And he said, "Yeah, look, but before I worked here, I've done this." And he went and told them a bit about what he'd done in the past. He said, I've had this situation. So, that's how I deal with it, exactly how, Ken and Russell have been talking about it. They're exactly right. This is what I do. But it demonstrated to the other people that there was this wealth of experience and skill within their team that they didn't know about. So it wasn't just about we had a bit of a laugh and a joke with amazing. People. They had that, but they also found, holy crap, we've got some really talented people here who going forward, if I put that situation as perhaps a newer leader, he's the guy I'm going to go and ask because I'm going to ring that guy up. Right? Yeah, for sure. Anybody wants to buy, he said, "As long as you buy me a coffee, I'm happy to do that and help you out." And that was the great learning for the team over and above what we were teaching them. That they noticed that they had some great resource within that group they didn't know anything about.
Yeah, that's that force multiplier that I was talking about. Just don't think about the event as a transactional event where you're going to teach people skills. You're also going to build solid relationships, right? Anybody who's played team sports, practice is almost as important. Well, I shouldn't say almost. Practice is more important than the game. Game is only what you've executed at practice, right? The bond building, the beers after, the laughs, the giggles, the amazement at performance that were not expected. That all comes at practice. And game time is just when you show it in front of a public. So, Ken, what is the one book, one reference, the one thing that is by your side and has been by your side for the longest that you refer back to when it comes time to leadership or owning your own business? What's the one book reference that you always go back to?
The thing that I've been going back to a lot lately since I discovered it is both the book and the podcast by Adam Grant. So Adam Grant is an organizational psychologist out of the Wharton School of Business, and I first came across him through his marvelous podcast, which is produced by TED. The same people that do the TED Talks, they do a number of podcasts. And I really like his podcast, and I really like what I learned from there, because he really he interviews some of his clients, and he interviews them about what makes their organizations exceptional. And they're often really simple things. And he goes outside of his clients as well. And I also like his book called Originals. And there's a lot of overlap between both the book and the podcast. And I'll give you an example that ties to something you said earlier, Martin. You talked about getting feedback from your employees as the leader, as the CEO of the company. And virtually the scenario you described about being on a sales call and being too enthusiastic, he is described in one of the podcasts. He interviews Ray Danilo, who runs a company called Bridgewater Associates, which is one of the most successful investment firms. But it wasn't originally. Danilo actually had a failed business beforehand, and he realized the reason the business had failed was because nobody was telling him the mistakes he was making, because they didn't want to piss off the leader. So when he started this new company called Bridgewater Associates, one of their core values is radical candor. Radical candor. Speaking truth to power all the time, every time, no matter how much it hurts. And Danilo has a great story. In the podcast, they interview both somebody who's new to the organization and how hard it is to kind of be on both the receiving and the giving end of that kind of feedback. And then they also interview Danilo, who talks a story that's very similar to yours, where somebody came up to him and it was actually a low-level employee that sent him an email that said, "Ray, you sucked in that meeting today, and that can't happen again." Right? And this is a new employee, this is a low-level employee, right? So Ray calls him up. He's like, "What are you talking about? What do you mean I sucked?" And he got really angry. And the employee was like, "No, this is what you did. You blah, blah, blah. You talked about yourself. You talked about the company. You didn't ask questions." And Ray went, "What do you mean?" And he went and talked to somebody else who was in the meeting. And the other person was like, yeah, you did. And Ray went back to that employee and said, "Thank you very much for that feedback, because that's what makes the company better." And so what I love about that particular story is that it tells us values in action.
Oh.
It tells us that the leader has to live those values. And by living the values, the leader has to be humble enough to be able to receive feedback when the leader transgresses those values.
Value is in action. Oh, I love that one. I'm writing it down, actually.
Wow, great.
And
that's just one example of the wealth of stories that are in both the book originals and in the podcast, which is called Work Life with Adam Grant. So I would recommend those to your viewers as well.
Fabulous. Thank you very much.
Well, if I had to pick one, it would be Colin Powell's 18 Tenets of Leadership. And so, as most people will know, Colin Powell, former general in the U.S. Military, and then as Secretary of State under George W. Bush. But he had done a series of talks on that and variations on it over time. But you can easily search it up on Google, just in the 18 Tenets of Leadership. And although he's talking about it from his time in the military, it is so transferable to any work you're doing as a leader. And there's a couple perhaps that come to mind for me. One was about delegating responsibility as close to the front line as possible. So in a business sense, if you delegate responsibility for decision making as close to the people doing the job as you can, rather than keeping the decision-making responsibility at head office. So, if you go into a coffee shop and you get your order and your order's wrong and you ask for a refund, you would expect that the barista is able to resolve that situation for you. Whether they give you the refund, they give you a revised order, they give you free coffees next time, they can make those decisions. They don't have to phone Toronto and say, what do I do about this? And we'll get back to the customer in 3 weeks' time. So delegating responsibility to people actually doing the job. Why? Because they see most of the situations happening on a day-to-day basis, and they're able to make those decisions because they're in the here and now. The other one that he talks about is linked to that is building trust, and building trust with your team. And he gives a wonderful story of his time at the infantry school at Fort Benning in Georgia, where the drill sergeant had said to them, do you want to build a relationship with your soldiers that they will follow you, even if it's just out of curiosity? They trust you in that way, that you have their interests at heart. You're not going to put them in harm's way unnecessarily. And therefore, when you say, we're going here, they're going to follow you, even if they don't understand the full picture or everything that's going on, because they believe that they can trust you and you believe have their interests at heart. And then linked to that, the final point that sticks with me is he said that when soldiers, or we could say employees, stop coming to you as their leader with their problems, then you've got a problem. Because if people won't come to you, and that's not you taking responsibility for their problems or taking it on, but if people don't feel that they can come and talk to you about what's going on for them, whether it's purely work-related or partly, perhaps it's in their private life as well, they can't come and speak to you. They're going to go and speak to somebody, and if it's not you, you've got a problem as a leader, because they obviously don't trust you that you can support them, help them, give them guidance, or even if it's referring them to some specialist help. you're adding no value, so there's no point in them coming to speak to you. So, anyone's interested, Colin Powell's 18 Tenets of Leadership, great favourite of mine. You can download it as a PDF off of Google. Great stuff.
Oh, and I like the book. I like the book, but I find 18's too many. You know what? Give me 3. Yeah. Like, and there may be 6 subsets under each of those 3, totaling 18. But give me 3. And one of the things I like about the models and the work that Russell and I do around in I Need to Effing Talk to You and all the other programs we run is we keep them simple. And we keep we keep them they're anacronyms, they're easy to remember, and they're simple and short steps because we expect people to be able to remember them under stress. Right? Like, correct. So I got this conversation, and these difficult workplace conversations we've been describing are stressful. Your adrenaline gets pumping, your heart's pounding, your brain's working at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And if I have to remember 18 principles of leadership and 18 steps that I need to follow in order to properly structure this conversation, it's like I'm not going to be able to do that, right? But if you give me like the 3 things I need to do: trust, respect, strategy. Perfect. I can do those.
So we, in Canadian Armed Forces, I still remember all 11 of our, know yourself, ensure that you technically sound, be the example. All of that, I've summarized those 3 to be a good tactical operator or operational leader is really direction, support, and open lines of communication. Those are 3 things that I stick to. I like yours. Trust. How do you build trust? It's just so powerful in itself. It's like love. It's like care. There's so many things that can fit in there, but you can say, do I trust them and do they trust me? And it's a very easy question to answer. It's a yes or no. But I mean, it is complex in how you do it, but absolutely. I mean, gentlemen, thank you so very much for being on the show. It was absolutely delightful. I think we could have kept on going. There might be a part 2 to this.
Absolutely. It's been a lot of fun.
Fabulous. People can reach out to you on LinkedIn, I'm assuming, as well?
Yeah, you can reach out to us on LinkedIn. You can also find us at our webpage, ineedtoeffingtalktoyou.com.
And you guys got a podcast as well that is on iTunes and all the platforms as well, right?
It's on all the platforms, iTunes, Spotify, etc.
Fabulous. With that being said, my name is Martin Hunter. I'm the host of What CEOs Talk About, where we translate vision into frontline operations. Today, we really gave a lot of good leadership tools for people to bite into and sink into and use. Please like, subscribe, and click that notification bell so that you know when the next episode is out. And with that being said, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to What CEOs Talk About. Make sure to click subscribe to get notified about future episodes, or check us out at www.whatceostalkabout.com.